Domestic violence, sexual assault, and other forms of abuse are chronic social problems that the legislature is constantly trying to get a handle on, and this year is no exception. Hi, I'm Representative Roger Goodman, and I'm coming to you from the virtual world. This year, like last year, the legislative session is being conducted remotely because of the continuing threat of the COVID pandemic. I have been working on issues related to domestic violence and sexual assault since the beginning of my legislative career. Last year, we enacted a major piece of legislation, House Bill 1320, a very strong law to give survivors and victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and harassment, and also for vulnerable adults, the ability to get protection orders from courts to protect them against their abusers. During the pandemic, courthouses had to close, and so victims had no access to the courts. And so instead, the courts got innovative and created virtual and online means of getting protection orders so that the petitions could be filed online, the hearings could be conducted virtually, and the service of the protection orders and notice to the abusers could be done by text message or other electronic means. It actually worked remarkably well. House Bill 1320 made these innovative means permanent so that victims and survivors of abuse no longer have to go to the courthouse. They don't have to choose between finding childcare or going to work or sitting in traffic and going to the court. And there is due process for the abusers, so everything is very well balanced. This also protects the victims and survivors from having to face their abusers in court. It was a major piece of legislation which not only provided these new forms of access to justice for victims, but also acknowledged new trauma-informed practices to help victims through the process, and also acknowledged the troubling trend of abuse of younger and younger victims. With major pieces of legislation, it's inevitable that the legislature has to come back and make refinements and clarifications to the law. And so we did receive feedback from judges and from court clerks, from prosecutors, and from advocates for victims and survivors for further refinements and improvements. As a result, I have now introduced in this legislative session House Bill 1901, which implements these further reforms so that victims and survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence can get the justice they need and the protection from their abusers. In House Bill 1901, there is a major new significant policy change: the recognition of what's called coercive control in the definition of domestic violence. Many people think of domestic violence as always being physically violent, but domestic abuse actually includes emotional harm and psychological harm, which is often more traumatic than being physically assaulted. If we were to include coercive control in the definition of domestic violence, survivors will now be able to get protection from their abusers when their abusers inflict this emotional and psychological harm, which restricts their personal liberty and their free will. Examples of coercive control include threats of physical harm or actual physical harm against friends and families and pets, damaging property and items of special value, or depriving the victim of those items of special value. Using technology to threaten or intimidate or harass the victim, including cyberstalking, monitoring the victim, distributing embarrassing images or fabricating intimate images and distributing them online, and commandeering social media accounts. Brandishing firearms in the home in an intimidating and threatening manner, confining the victim from friends and family and other social supports, threatening suicide or self-harm, threatening to make private information public, financial exploitation, and just controlling aspects of daily life, including the use of phones, the use of money, and where the victim may go. There are many other examples of coercive control, and we need to account for coercive control or emotional or psychological abuse in the law so that victims can get the protection they need. House Bill 1901, which includes all of these important provisions, has moved out of the House Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee and will be coming to the House floor for a full vote. And then I hope over to the Senate, and then finally to the governor's office for enactment into law. This will be a very important new step to protect our victims of sexual assault and domestic violence so that we can have safer homes and safer communities. This is part of my ongoing work in the legislature to reduce harm in our society, to make sure that people can live fulfilling lives. Thank you very much for your attention to this important matter, and I'll be coming back to you with another Good Minute very soon.